So we're here, we're doing a podcast, and this is Joel Kowalski. For those of you who don't know Joel Kowalski, he is the Vice President of Operations at Wilderness Tours. He's also the river manager at Wilderness Tours as well. Grew up on the Ottawa River, and so I would say that you probably know the river intimately at this point.
I know it pretty well. I grew up on the river, started paddling, when I was in my young teens, going on 23 years here on the river. So yeah, it's home. It's where I work. Love to have fun out there. Love to explore. It's a great place to have as a backyard.
Yeah. So before we get started on the Ottawa River and the watershed and everything, how did you find yourself starting to really keep up with the water levels here? How did you find yourself trying to forecast those flows? Like, what was the thing that dictated you becoming interested in it?
It started out just from my interest in surfing the waves of the Ottawa, of which there are many. The Ottawa and this part of the world is blessed with an incredible number of high quality river surfing waves that are great for kayaking. There's other ways to enjoy them, but I go kayaking on them. And especially in the springtime when we get the really high water surges, between here and some areas closer to Quebec City, we have what is basically the equivalent of the North Shore of Hawaii, but in river terms for surf waves. So my main interest came from just touring around with my friends, surfing on these river waves and having to get to know the flows so that we could drive around, have fun, surf waves, and make the most of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for those of you that are like myself and have very little to do with winter and having to deal with the devil's dandruff snow, what is kind of that spring season like? We've got to just kind of set the picture for everyone.
Yeah. Winter is long here. All right. We'll have 4 to 5 solid months of snowy, cold weather. And what that means is that a snowpack builds up through the winter, and come springtime, it's all going to melt. On top of that, we're going to get some fairly significant spring rains usually, and that runoff of melting snow and spring rain combined can surge water levels in big ways all over the place, especially for the main stem rivers, which the Ottawa is one of them. And so it's a time of year where there is a lot of change. We go from snowed in, cold, dark, and a couple weeks later, spring is bursting, levels are rising, and it's a really neat time of year because so much changes, so much life comes back, and it's a lot of fun.
Okay, so there's a lot of melting that happens, and I guess the next thing that we have to kind of share is how big the river corridor is. How big is the river basin?
Sure. So the Ottawa River Basin is about, basin size is 146,000 square kilometers. That's about 56,000 square miles. That's about the size of England. So it's a big area, which means when all of that snow and ice melts all roughly at the same time, it's more or less like a flash flood. We call it a runoff, and that's what surges our water levels and brings in all those fun waves, but of course can also bring some spring flooding.
Okay. So what are the main tributaries for kayakers as we're looking at it from a kayaker's perspective right now? What are the main tributaries of the Ottawa River?
Sure. There are many. The main ones that kayakers will have heard of are the Gatineau River, the Rouge River, the Madawaska, the Kippawa, and the Petawawa, the Des Moines, the Coulonge, the Lièvre, the Montreal, the Kinojavis, the Jocko, the Mattawa. There are more. Those are a lot of the main contributors.
Okay. And in between all of those contributors and here, how many dams are actually in between here and there?
Up the main stem of the Ottawa, there are about 15 significant dams. But once you start looking at all the tributaries of the Ottawa, it gets closer to probably 60. So it's a basin that has a lot of hydroelectric potential. That's been built into dams. Some have meaningful reservoirs. Most don't. They're mostly run-of-river systems with small reservoirs. And so where we're located here, the Whitewater section that most people know about of the Ottawa is called the Rocher Fendu. That's French for split rock. So downstream of us are cities of Ottawa and Montreal. There are 4 major dams downstream of us, and there's about 11 upstream of us.
Okay. So what you're saying is of those 60 dams, there's a few that have some ability to hold back meaningful water prior to the split rock section. I'm not going to try to do the French pronunciation. I'm from the South. We're not going to do that to you guys. So you're saying that there's only a few that actually can hold back meaningful water. Is that correct?
That's right. Up the main stem of the Ottawa, Lake Temiskaming has some storage capacity. 15, which is French for 15, has some storage capacity. Rapid 7 has some storage capacity. Dozwa is further upstream from there. But downstream of Temiskaming is upstream of us here by quite a ways, a couple hundred kilometers. A lot of the main tributaries that can add a lot of water to the Ottawa come in downstream of Temiskaming, and a bunch of them don't have any dams on them, which from a kayaker's point of view can be great, right? From a flood prevention point of view means there is no flood prevention. If those tributaries flood, that's it. They're coming in, they're adding water. And so basically, on the other tributaries, the Madawaska has a couple dams that have some meaningful capacity for storage. The biggest reservoir in the whole system is actually on the Gatineau River, just upstream of Maniwaki. Anyone who's been to high tension wave on the Gatineau River, the dam I'm talking about is just upstream from there. Otherwise, this part of the world isn't all that mountainous, and therefore when you're building dams, like they don't have a lot of vertical height, so they don't actually have that much volume relative to the flow rates that this river can see.
Okay. So one of the things that is really prevalent in the Southeast is we have a lot of river gorges that eventually became dams. And so we're used to bottom release lakes. Very few of them are actually spillover or spillway dams. So it's one of those things that is actually unique to this area as well, as not having as many of those kind of bottom release dams in the area. So that's something that is particularly important to understand when it comes to a spring forecast. The other thing that we want to discuss are the other parameters that dictate the spring runoff, specifically from a kayaker's perspective and Stakeout. And then we want to also think about how that affects people in the kind of the same region from like a flooding perspective as well, because you have traditional floods, which might be, more often than every 5 or 6 years. And then you have your 100-year floods. And then as those of you who, live in the Western North Carolina, East Tennessee area, you've experienced a 10,000 or 30,000 year flood this year. And so it's important to understand the difference between the different flooding events and what you could expect in a normal year versus a higher than normal year. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, what are the other parameters, I guess, or is what we're kind of looking for?
Sure, yeah. Because we deal with a significant winter season that brings in the snow and ice factor, flooding and spring runoff here is not just a factor of rainfall events. So there's actually months of lead up that can contribute towards a spring major flooding scenario. So a good thing to point out for those who don't know that the Ottawa had a succession of minor and major flood events. 2017, 2019, and 2023 were all flood years, and not the fun stakeout surfing, kayaking wave kind of flood. We had a lot of flooding of people's houses and homes and cottages. 2019 being the biggest one of those, which we even had to sandbag the house that we're in right now. We had a lot of neighbors, family. It was a big deal. The military was rolling around helping with sandbagging, and it also comes at a time when, because these things happen first thing in the spring, when all of the ice lets go and all of the spring runoff comes down, it's freezing cold. There's ice in the river. So not only is flooding, catastrophic for the people who have to experience it, there's the whole temperature factor with the water, the ice. And so what sets the stage for a spring runoff major flood here are ground conditions, snowpack type, and the speed which it all melts in the spring. So these handful of variables can dramatically change what's going to happen when all of that frozen water becomes liquid water.
Okay. So what are the resources that you're using to kind of create a forecast for yourself? Because with the way that things run at Wilderness Tours, depending on water levels, that will change the route that we take down the section of the river. It will also change whether or not we use a jet-powered Zodiac to run coverage for our rafting trips as well. So how do you go about creating yourself a forecast to understand what you're expecting to see and how you allocate the resources at Wilderness Tours?
Yeah. I don't have a scientific background in this. I didn't go to school to study this stuff. I don't write out equations to come up with what I see. But from my experience traveling across what are pretty large areas, across the Ottawa River Basin, across the Lac Saint-Jean and Saguenay region basin, what I observed and started to understand are, the snowpack depths, the ground freeze matters a lot. And then I just found resources online that would sort of back up what I'm seeing. And then after many years of watching this spring cycle repeat and then experiencing it out on the river and following the water levels closely, I just got a bit of a intuition about it. And so one of my main resources is NOAA's snowpack water content. That's a huge driving factor as to how big a rain or how big a runoff is going to be. So there are actually maps that will show you not the depth of the snow, because that doesn't matter as much, but how much water does that snowpack contain? Because a snowpack can contain 30 inches of rain. Like, that's a huge amount, right? Just locked up in snow and ice. And if that all goes very quickly, it creates huge volumes of water. Luckily, it almost never liquefies instantly, right? There's always some form of gradual melting. Sometimes it's very fast. But then it's sort of stacks. So in 2019, for example, in the fall of 2018, we had a very wet fall, October. Like, I remember the sequence of events. We had a wet October, and then the ground was saturated. And then we had a early sharp freeze to the winter. So we had all of this wet soil across a huge basin area freeze solid. Now this becomes like concrete. The ground is no longer permeable. And that itself is also locked up liquid waiting to be released. On top of that, we had not a record snowfall winter, but it was in the top 2 or 3 for snowpack. And it had a very high water content in that snow. And we had a consistently cold winter with a deep snowpack, meaning that there was no midwinter thaw. So there was no time where this snowpack ever melted off a little bit, which can happen most winters. And so basically like the potential just like was starting to stack up and stack up and stack up. And there was no movement in the other direction. And then not only did we have a consistently cold winter with a lot of snow, winter just kept dragging on. And so it got later and later, and there was still snow and it was still cold. And we were getting to late April. You know, we were passing sort of the Easter time frame. And I was looking around, I was like, there is still like 6 feet of snow. Like it's a huge snowpack. All of the maps were showing just like maximum snowpack water content. And in the springtime, I'm always keeping my eye on long-term weather forecasts and, you know, when are things going to start to melt? And a forecast came out that was going to flip the entire weather. So we were going to go from consistently cold to not just a little warm, which starts to gradually melt things, but we're going to go to like 22 degrees Celsius. We're going to...
Units, what is that?
Freedom units, I mean, we're talking like 80 degrees.
So freedom units being for people like myself that are from the States and still don't have a great indication of what Celsius is.
Yeah, so
just to put that out there.
We're going like from, 75, 80 degrees in that range, and it's coming with a big, warm rain front. So not only is it getting warm, everything's going to melt, we're getting rain on top of it. And don't forget that ground is fully frozen underneath it. And so, that one for me was pretty easy to call. Like it wasn't like if you could see all the factors, it was just obvious we were going to have a big flood. So, I tried to let my family and neighbors know as well as I could. And then it went even bigger than I expected, but only because it was, we were dealing with factors that were just outside of my experience. I had not seen a winter like that on top of conditions like that. And so we had a huge flood. And to put things in perspective, a normal spring high water mark on the Ottawa, when we're surfing the really big waves like Gladiator and Ruins, the Rocher Fendu will peak at about 3,300 cubic meters per second, 3,500, somewhere in that range. And that works out to be like 150,000 CFS. Pretty nice flows. Like that's a lot of fun. In 2019, it was about 5,400 cubic meters per second. So, we were getting close to like 250,000 CFS, pushing 300,000. Like it was really big. It was even bigger downstream of us. So places like Ottawa had major flooding. Places like Montreal had major flooding. And there are rapids in those cities. So like there's current, there's ice blocks coming down. It was a big event. For those of you who aren't familiar with
Ontario and Quebec and just Canadian geography, the Ottawa is actually a tributary to the St. Lawrence, which runs through the heart of Montreal. When it comes to that spring in particular, what were some of the side effects of the flooding that did actually happen? What were some of the safeguards that were put in place? What were some of the things that the local authorities and government put in place to try to protect those who were close to the river?
Sure. Yeah. There were a lot of good things that were done. The military was mobilized to just get bodies out helping. Sandbags were made available all over the place, with, plenty of volunteers helping. A lot of our local paddling community just jumped in, which is great because outside of the paddling community, not a lot of people have dry suits. And when you're dealing with ice cold water and people's houses are flooding, you can't last that long trying to sandbag when the water's rising fast and you need to be in the water. I mean, I remember being up to my neck trying to sandbag around people's house foundations so that we could start pumping it out, and the water was still rising fast. So it was a big mobilization relatively quickly as things were getting serious. Then there were other things that different levels of government did. So one was there was a federal level ban on boating on the Ottawa River. And the intention there was to keep motorboats off of the open water in the interest of keeping wake disturbance down, so that wasn't affecting people's sandbag walls and potentially collapsing sandbag walls. So, that certainly had some rationale to it. Our operation got swept up in that because, we raft on the Ottawa River. Upstream and downstream from us are very navigable, long, flat sections of the Ottawa. But of course, we raft on the Whitewater section in the Rocher Fendu, and the boating ban, of course, kept us from opening our rafting season, even though you might be surprised, but the section of river here was still totally raftable despite the record high flooding. But that's only because of some unique geography we have here where the river splits into a maze of channels rather than being locked up in one single channel where water levels can get really crazy if you're like in a river that has a gorge, right? Like it can get nuts. But because we always seem to have like a next spillover channel that we can go down, we would have rafted here totally fine. So we had to go and raft some other tributaries, which was fine. It was extra work that I would not want to do again. But we managed. So yeah, that was that flood 2019. Lot of stuff there.
So you obviously talked about the snowpack and kind of the water content within.
Yep.
Are there other kind of government agencies that provide information that you're using through that that kind of that forecasting window? Are you
Sure.
Is it just NOAA that you're using?
No. The dams themselves do provide quite a lot of real-time data, which is great. The Ottawa River is the border between Ontario and Quebec. So we have two provincial level hydroelectric companies. We've got Ontario Power Generation in Ontario, and we have Hydro-Quebec in Quebec. And they funnel their dam outflow data to one website, ottawariver.ca. It's very easy to look up and see which dams are flowing which flow rates and what their reservoir levels are at. And so the data is always very available. And during the spring runoff season, they do a pretty decent job of providing regular updates as to what they expect. So whether they expect major flooding, minor flooding, average runoffs, things like that.
Okay. When you're making decisions for wilderness tours and this section of river here, what is the dam that you're looking at the most as you're trying to create kind of like that 3 to 4 day forecast in your mind, trying to decide, are we going to be on the main channel, the middle channel? Are we going to need a Zodiac or are we not going to need a Zodiac? Those kind of decisions.
Yeah, the dam directly upstream from us is called Desjoachins. In English, Swisha. So that's the dam that you can look at, see what the flow is, and know that within 2 days, what we're going to have. The Pembroke Lake water level. Pembroke is a town of about 16,000 people just upstream from us. That lake level is very indicative of what we will have about a day later. So between those two metrics, I can get a pretty clear picture of what we're going to be dealing with in the short term. A few dams upstream from Swisha is Temiskaming. And because the channel of the Ottawa is pretty straight line between Temiskaming and Swisha, and the tributaries between them aren't all that significant. You can also look at Temiskaming and know about 4 to 5 days in advance what we're going to have. So that correlates pretty neatly as well. So those plus what some of our immediate local tributaries are doing. So directly upstream from our put-in is a pretty significant tributary called the Kowalski. It's not as significant as like the Gatineau, for example, but it is a pretty relevant tributary. And so the Kowalski can easily add 1 to 600 cubic meters per second of additional flow, depending on what kind of spring runoff event we're having. There's a couple other smaller ones too that all add up to be some notable increase in flow addition between Swisha and us.
Okay. So there's a lot of there's a fair amount of, I guess, familiarity with the Shaggy designs gauge. How does Gwyn interpolate that information in his gauge to the actual river levels that we're seeing coming from upstream?
With the Shaggy design gauge, it's mainly just a mirror of the physical gauge, basically a vertical height gauge, with a reference point of 0, which is more or less the average midsummer water level. So anyone who's familiar with Babyface or Garburator or Push Button, those are water levels that we see midsummer, late July, mid-August, and those hover around 0. And so the Shaggy gauge correlates to the physical gauge, which goes from 0. The physical gauge ends up at 22 feet, but Gwyn's Shaggy Designs gauge does a good job of just extrapolating above that. There is also a negative range of water level values. That doesn't mean the river goes dry. It's just below that sort of average summer water level. And so the gauge goes down to -4 or -5. And so for a long time before we were getting more and more data from the dams, that's really the main way anyone referenced the water levels in here. Whereas now, because the dam data is pretty good, the Shaggy Designs gauge and the physical gauge are great for our day-to-day rafting operations. They're great for day-to-day kayakers talking about which wave they're going to go and surf. But when it comes to forecasting water levels for our rafting operations, it's really all about looking at the cubic meters per second, the dam outflow data.
Okay. And aside from the NOAA and the dam outflow data, is there anything else that you're using? I know that you use a couple of specific apps when it comes to deciding what is the long-term forecast that you've had some really good luck with. Which app?
Yeah, I mostly watch radars. And again, I don't have a scientific background in this. I'm not a meteorologist, okay? But you're a kayaker. A lot of the audience here will be kayakers. A lot of these air masses, weather events, they move a lot like eddy lines and whirlpools. Like, you can kind of see this stuff once you look at it long enough. You can see the river patterns that we're all used to. So again, a mix of just seeing what I see in the radars. And then also I do follow some really high quality YouTube channels on weather forecasting. One of my favorites is Ryan Hall, y'all. I don't know if you know that one, but he's great. Yeah.
We'll link it down below in the description.
Yeah. Ryan Hall, y'all is great. He's always going over all kinds of the long-term models. And so, watching some real meteorologists doing some cool homework on what's coming, plus a bit of intuition, plus some of these other neat places to get data is sort of how I put together a gut feel on what's happening.
All right, cool. So we're not calling it a forecast. It's a gut feel.
Yeah.
I get gut feels after too much Indian food. So, so what I want to do is just kind of back up. We've talked a lot about 2019 already.
Yeah.
2023 was another high water year. And I want to talk about this past year, which is relevant as well, because when looking at the snowpack and the water content within the snowpack this past year, it didn't have a tremendous amount of water, but then it just seemingly was the case that we were stuck at higher than normal water levels throughout the summer. So let's talk first about 2023 and then 2024 and what contributing factors led to the high water in 23, and then what contributing factors happened with our season this year, just so we have a better understanding.
Sure. I think it's good to sort of contrast high water from a relative point of view of a kayaker for summertime flows and major flood levels, because you're right. We had a non-existent snowpack this year. Like there was almost no winter at all here this year. We did have some notable spring rain. We had some pretty sizable spring rain events, which are important all on their own. And, you know, from out of nowhere, we got a spring runoff that went up to, you know, it's like spring came back, but it was by no means a flood, right? And then we did have sustained, again, relative high water through the summer. For those who have paddled the Ottawa, you know, we were bouncing up and down, up to 12, almost touching, 13 and a half, down to 7, up to 10, down to 4, up to 10, those kinds of ranges, which, I mean, those are so much fun. Like that is high water compared to Garburator. But compared to, some of these minor and major flooding events, it doesn't really compare. So, even though we did have some blasts of water coming seemingly out of nowhere, it still wasn't the same level of runoff event.
So with those blasts of water, correct me if I'm wrong, but from my understanding, those blasts of water came from big rain events that were coming from the Gulf of Mexico,
Sure,
traveling up through the Great Plains and basically traversing through the Ottawa River Valley,
yep,
hitting basically the entire basin,
yep,
and then traveling out back into the Atlantic Ocean. Is that correct?
That's where a lot of our main rain events can come from. We can get it. We can get it from 3 different directions. I mean, we can get rain events from moisture coming up from the Gulf of Mexico. We can get moisture coming from across from the Pacific. It can make it all the way over to us. And then sometimes with a low pressure system moving up the east coast of the US, we can get Atlantic moisture being flung in from the east to the west. Although our biggest rain events do tend to come from those really warm, moist systems pumping straight up from the Gulf of Mexico, up the Great Plains, across the Midwest, and right over top of us. Usually when I'm looking at the radars and I'm looking at what kind of rain events are going to move the needle for our water levels on the Ottawa, I set kind of what I call the goalposts. And the goalposts for me are if a major rain event is landing between us or Pembroke and Temiskaming and is traveling from southwest to northeast, that's going to impact our water levels in a way that matters.
So what we're kind of talking about and making reference to is the past summer that we had this year, 2024. Again, we started the season off at Garburator levels in, I guess that was April. Yeah. There were Garburator surfs had in April, which is, in my experience, I've never seen it that low that early. And then to contrast it, 2023 was not necessarily a epic flooding event like in 2019. However, the water was higher than I had seen it before here. What was the peak flow during 2023? I believe we hit somewhere around 29 feet.
It was notable.
Extrapolated gauge on Shaggy
right.
design.
It was notable. Yeah, if you extrapolate the vertical height gauge, we did hit 29 feet in 2023, but we hit 35 in 2019. So it's a big difference, although still very notable. When we hit 29 feet on the Ottawa, that means the river is well up in the trees.
It washed the stairs off of the Lorne lunch site. The stairs got washed downstream from there.
Yeah.
Which was
that's big. 29 is huge. 29 feet is huge. Yep. Yeah. Gladiator comes in at about 22 and a half, 23 feet. So it Gladiator fully flushes out at about 24 and a half feet. So anything above that, Coliseum is, just on a different level.
Yeah. Yeah, the thing that was most notable on the laps that we did in that early spring, the Lorne Rapid is completely underwater. The Bussy Island is barely at the tip, is barely out of the water. There's only 4 or 5 feet out of the water. So it was, from a vertical standpoint, it's pretty impressive. I think the thing to remember too is when you have a vertical height as it goes up and kind of traverses out of the banks, your vertical height no longer has the same volume, per foot on a river gauge as well. As soon as it gets beyond and it extends beyond the riverbank, that additional foot might have another 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 CFS, associated with it. And again, I'm pulling numbers out of thin air because I'm not used to hearing numbers like 200, 300, 400,000 CFS. That's not something that really, from a Southeastern kayaker's perspective, we like inches in the river. So it's taken some getting used to seeing those bigger numbers. And that's the whole reason they use cubic meters, because the numbers are less scary that way. So I think the last kind of big thing that I want to talk about are mainly kayaker specific things. Obviously you were talking zero is when you've got Babyface, you've got Garburator, Push Button. Those are great summertime river levels.
Yep.
What are the waves that people should have their eyes out for on the Ottawa? I know people are familiar with minibus, big bus, Gladiator. Those are going to be things that people have heard of before.
Yeah.
But those aren't the only waves. And obviously we want to identify what those river levels are for people as well, because, obviously as things continue to progress, we'd love to see more of you up here surfing and enjoying the waves up here. But I can tell you, having not visited this area before, I didn't know where to pull that information from. And aside from some older resources that do outline the midsummer surf levels, there's not really a whole lot of information that dictates what waves are good when and where they are.
Sure.
So,
another really notable wave in the spring high water season is the Ruins in the city of Ottawa. And that comes in at about 3,500 cubic meters per second there. And that's one of the top level waves on the same level of Big Bus and Minibus and Gladiator. High Tension is another fantastic wave that a number of folks will have heard of, but maybe not everyone. That's on the Gatineau River, which is the biggest tributary to the Ottawa, and that comes in at they have a vertical height gauge there, and it's really worth surfing anytime you start getting to about 19 feet up to 23 feet on their gauge. That's worth traveling to. The Ottawa has a lot of mid-level and non-flood surf waves that never get mentioned. But if you were on any other river anywhere else, it would be people would drive from 8 hours away to go and surf it. And so the middle channel is loaded with great surf waves, even starting up at the top of the river at McCoy's, Sattlers, anytime you get up to 17 or 18 feet, so basically just above minibus water levels, Sattler's becomes an awesome wave. It's not eddy accessible, so you have to walk back up for it, but it's worth it. When you go down the middle channel, you get incredible surf spots like Angel's Kiss. You get Butterfly. Lower Garvin's is where you'll actually start to get some other pretty exciting surf waves where you can do air tricks. So Lower Garvin's is really good when we're in that 17 to 19 foot range. Downstream in Upper and Lower No Name, Infinity Wave is awesome, and that's in at tons of water levels. But Lower No Name has some really, really spectacular waves. Even as low as 12 and a half, the bottom of Lower No Name has one of my favorite waves on the river, but it has a super narrow water level range, basically from 12 to 12 and a half. It's right out in the middle of the outflow of the rapid. You have to surf through this pretty exciting wave to get to it. Up at the top of Lower No Name, there's a huge wave that forms at about 22 feet. That thing is awesome. It's basically right up in the middle, shifted towards the right.
And what's that wave called?
We usually just call it Upper Smoothie, referencing Big Smoothie, which is a wave in the middle of the rapid, which can be surfed at most water levels, even lower water levels. Big Smoothie exists, but actually gets very good at about 16 feet, same levels as minibus. Over on the main channel, Triple Nipple at 8.5 to 9 feet is one of the most underrated waves on the river. Waikiki at about 4.5 to 6 feet is incredible, like really incredible. And I mean, it just keeps going really. Like
chopping block.
Chopping block at 4.5, 3 feet.
Chopping block
6 feet.
Chopping block and Triple Nipple are two of my favorite waves that I've ever surfed.
That's right. It's incredible how spoiled we are with surf waves here. It's a handful of the big ones that make the rounds on the internet for video, but there are very few in between water levels here on the Ottawa. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the three kind of main waves that people do drive for in the spring. You've got minibus. What's kind of the range that an out-of-towner would find appropriate? And then let's talk about when people that live here actually paddle.
Yeah. So for minibus, I would say that it is worth traveling for. If you see water levels that are between 14 and 17 feet, that's something worth traveling for. It's especially better if you're 14 and a half to 16 and a quarter. Those are really like the premium ranges. My favorite water level is between 15 and 3/4 and 16 and a quarter.
Okay. And one of the things that Joel and I were talking about this weekend is that there is a difference between 14 on the way up versus 14 on the way down. So 14 on the way down, meaning that the lower pool is full and it has been full at a higher level. The wave doesn't stand up as tall. Is that correct?
Yep.
So basically you have more of a foam pile, whereas at 14 on the way up becomes a steeper wave. So it is something worth noting as well.
Yeah, you'll notice this effect on a lot of the big surf waves in the stakeout season, especially when you're dealing with huge volumes of water and really notable lake sizes above and below, especially below a lot of these waves. When the water levels are dropping or rising, it can really influence how much it's pushing or not pushing that downstream lake level.
Okay. So the other couple of waves that we need to talk about would be Big Bus and Gladiator. So Big Bus is actually on basically the same rapid and is the same extension of the same wave as Minibus. Minibus is on river left and Big Bus is just right of center. What is the Big Bus water level range on that Shaggy Designs gauge?
Sure. It's a narrower range. Big Bus is best between 19 and 3/4 and 20 and 3/4. So it's about a 1 foot range. It's not very big, and it's really best between 20 and 20.5. It just because of the shape of the rock ledge underneath that forms it, it just seems to be more sensitive to water levels. Minibus is in during a relatively bigger level range. So big bus can be a huge, intimidating hole if you try to surf it below those levels I just laid out, and then it flattens out pretty quickly above those levels.
Okay. And then Gladiator.
Yeah. So Gladiator is in basically as soon as big bus washes out. So, if big bus is washing out at about 21 feet, then Gladiator is going to be on its low side. Gladiator's low side is going to come with a notable foam pile, and Gladiator is quite a bit bigger than either minibus or big bus, and it's out in a pretty exposed middle of the river location, 3/4 of the way down Coliseum, and famously is right above the ledge of the Coliseum Rapid. Although if you wash off the wave, you will actually end up just to the right of the ledge, although you're always close enough that it's definitely on your mind. And it's really big, pushy whitewater. So Gladiator's not the kind of spot to just go and mess around. Like, if you're not actually a pretty comfortable Class 5 kayaker, Gladiator shouldn't really be on your radar. Minibus is definitely more attainable for a lot of people. The downstream flow is much more manageable. It's not like a lake, but it's, the water does slow down quite a bit a long time before the next rapids. The rapid is much easier to navigate. But getting back to Gladiator, it requires a big paddle out from whether you're starting river left or river right. It requires a huge paddle out to the middle of the rapid to line up, surf the wave. The wave itself is big and bouncy, and it's an incredible ride. Like the face of Gladiator is huge.
If you had to take a guess, how tall is it?
In vertical feet from trough to peak, it is realistically probably 15 to 17 feet tall, and probably 40 feet wide. So it's got an awesome surfable face. Yeah.
Is there a part of the face that you get a little bit nervous on while you're surfing it?
I mean, all of it, sure. Yeah. I mean, it is a fast, big ride. It's awesome. I mean, it's probably my favorite wave. Top 3.
Before you answer anything else, what are Joel's top 3 favorite waves?
My top 3 favorite waves are Ruins, Gladiator, and You Gotta Be Kidding Me.
Okay. Nice. All right. So 2 of the 3 right here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You Gotta Be Kidding Me is on the Mississippi River up in the Saguenay area of Lac Saint-Jean in Quebec. And the Mississippi is like the Ottawa in that it has a abnormal amount of incredible surf waves. In fact, it probably has more than the Ottawa during the spring high water season. It's got Black Mass, it's got You Gotta Be Kidding Me, it has Molly, it has Middle Earth. Those are the notable ones. So two incredible rivers.
Very cool. If someone's coming up here for their first time, what would be your suggestion if they really had in their mind's eye that they wanted to surf some of these river waves in the springtime, what are some of the things that you would suggest that people think about before they come here, and the pieces of gear that they're really going to want to think about having?
Yeah.
Or that maybe not even think about having, but are like super necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you want to come and paddle during the spring runoff season, and you're coming up to surf waves, you need to have really solid thermal gear. So a dry suit is recommendation number one. I wouldn't recommend doing the dry top and shorts combo. Like, you got to be dressed for the swim, especially a big swim. So definitely wear a dry suit. It's really a good idea to have airbags if you're not used to this kind of whitewater. It's a good recommendation no matter who you are. You definitely want to have a crew. Don't paddle alone. And gloves, skull cap, a paddle that, isn't going to break on you, a spray deck that isn't going to implode on you. Like a lot of this stuff that we're paddling in the high water season is pretty consequential whitewater, just because of the width of the water, the temperature of the water, and the potential that if you do nothing, there are rapids downstream that you will end up at.
Okay. So those are kind of the non-negotiables. And what are some of the other things that you have to think about from a kind of stakeout perspective? Like if somebody was coming up here before the wilderness tours, owl rafting seasons, what are the things that you have to have in your mind's eye when it comes to staying here, things of that nature? Because that is something that, as an previous outsider, I had no idea what the situation was, where you could camp, where you could stay, things like that.
There are campgrounds that are open. For example, our takeout campsites are available that time of year. So naturally, that's probably the best place to stay. But there's other places. There's always, motels, hotels, and cabins, Airbnbs. Like, there are towns that are not that far away. Like it's a fairly manageable area from a logistics point of view. We're certainly not out in the middle of nowhere, even though the river corridor itself definitely feels beautiful and wild and remote. The logistics and the ability to, stay somewhere warm and dry and go out to a restaurant to eat, like that's all still available. Maybe even like as close as 15 minutes away. So if you're looking at camping, then you definitely need to be ready to camp in cool to cold temperatures, especially if you're trying to follow the south to north movement of the stakeout season. Like, it's one thing to just come to the Ottawa when this or that wave is in.
It's already plenty cold here.
Yeah. But, the sort of stakeout season is you follow the spring runoff from south to north as the temperatures in sequence rise from the Ottawa River Basin up through Quebec to the Lac Saint-Jean region. And because the spread on those can be 2 or 3 weeks. So, typically when people ask me, hey, Joel, like, when should I come up? Like, if you're trying to plan months ahead of time, I typically tell people that the 3rd week of April is a really good bet of a good time to show up, and you're like gonna get some guaranteed great wave time. The 3rd week of April is probably when we are starting to peak on the Ottawa, which is a nice time to get here, because when you're here on the increasing water levels, that's colder, but also is when a lot of stuff is being flushed downstream. I mean, there are icebergs in the river, there's debris, there are docks, there are it's a huge basin upstream of us. And yeah, if you're here on the leading edge when the water's going up, that whole side of things is a real factor. So it's actually kind of nice to get here kind of at the peak water levels. Maybe that's Big Bus. Maybe that's around Gladiator levels, Ruins, right? Those are all pretty high probability for the third week of April. Fourth week of April, probably more of the same. Things might start to roll over and start coming down the first week of May. Maybe it drops down to Big Bus. Maybe it drops down to Mini Bus. Typically, a good pattern is you catch sort of that variety. And then as soon as we're down at Mini Bus, get a few good days on Mini Bus, and then you start looking north to go up to the rivers in Lac Saint-Jean.
Okay, right on. So I think that's pretty much it. I think the big thing that we wanted to do was make sure that there was a resource that people could come to start to find some of this information. And again, we're going to link all of the different resources that Joel's been looking at down in the description below. But Joel, I really appreciate you sharing your gut feelings with us. And I'm looking forward to seeing what this winter, holds for us and what the spring forecast will hold for us. And again, we will likely make a spring forecast video, assuming that Joel wants to do this again. But in doing so, we are going to obviously look at all of the different factors that he's, looking at as he's making his assessment. But I think the thing to remember and to note is that it is not an exact science on his end, but it is something that will allow you to start planning and have an idea of what things might look like when the spring melt comes. So Joel, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and pretty crazy. The thing I'd ask from you, the viewer, is if there's a specific topic, if there's a specific video idea that you have or you would like to have more information about, whether that is kayaking techniques, or if that is more information about the river, the corridor here, or just experiences from different individuals, experiences kayaking and their trips, leave those down in the comment below. Love to do more of these videos. Obviously, Joel is a wealth of knowledge and has a wealth of experiences. So please let us know what you would like to do, what you'd like to hear, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks, Casey.
Yeah, man.